Ah, finally, we're working and on air. Maybe you can hear me, maybe you can't, but maybe you'll let me know. Anyway, welcome to Adam's Music Box. It's the Saturday stream that we typically have on Saturdays. Now, I want to talk about that much over talked decade, but it's over talked for some good reasons. It's quite an important one in the overall history of music, and this, of course, is the 1960s. Now, if I were to ask sort of the ordinary man on the street, who is the most important seminal artist who ruled the 60s? Nine and a half people out of 10 would say the Beatles. And I'd be really curious about that because I've never met half a person. But then again, I'm not half the man I used to be. So said Paul. And I don't want to take away anything from the Beatles, who were, in fact, a revolutionary and important group of musicians. But I would like to offer a counter argument as to who was the king of the 60s, or at least who was one of the joint members of a 1960s musical oligarchy. Because as music trends are in the real world and in real time, there's rarely an instance in music where one artist is there to rule them all. Typically, music is more like an oligarchy than like a kingdom where there's a group of artists who are domineering. It's very rare that at any given moment in time there's one artist to rule them all. Maybe Michael Jackson when Thriller came out. Not too many other instances of that. Now, in the 60s, there was a wide variety of music going on. That can be attested to, that can be discovered by looking at the charts of the day, which albums were selling, which singles were selling. Look at radio playlists of the day. Look at what they were talking about in the magazines and on television. You can't necessarily go into the bars and the schools and whatever and hear what they were saying. You need a flux capacitor for that. But we still have a very good idea. You can even talk to people who were around in the 60s because many of them are still there. Some of them might even be on a YouTube channel near you. Anyway, the 60s, like every other decade, every other epoch in music, wasn't a monolith. In terms of musical styles and musical genres. And with all of that sort of, sorry, the humidity, it gets worse and worse and worse always. Anyway, with all of that sort of disclaimer out of the way, I'd like to posit that none other than Herb Alpert was the king of 60s music. And there are a number of reasons for it. First was the ubiquity of his music and its popularity. People absolutely loved Herb Alpert's music. And that's why I encourage you to listen to it, because this is one instance where democracy works. People liked his music because it was genuinely good. His original compositions, his unique arrangements of music that he covered, his unique playing, that interesting style that he brought in with the Tijuana Brass, it all worked so well. And it helped to define an era, because there's many different sides of any particular era, especially when we use this arbitrary measuring stick of a decade in order to determine what that era is. I just hit the microphone. Sorry if you're wearing headphones. Now, one of the sort of attitudes, cultural phenomena of the 60s was this idea of the cool lifestyle. It was an era of immense prosperity in the United States, and a lot of people decided to do cool things with it. Drive really beautiful cars, fill their homes with mid century modern furniture and electronics designed in that same style, wear the chic, sort of minimalistic, but very angular and cool clothing of that era. And that needed a soundtrack, and not consciously wanting to make a soundtrack of that era, but because he was so popular among the people who were a bit older than teenagers, but a lot younger than old people. Herb Alpert's music was popular among that demographic. Anyone from, let's say, their mid to late 20s up to the sort of mid to pushing late 50s, they were buying up Herb Alpert's records by the score. And the only artist, or not, maybe not the only one, but one of the only ones to have three number one albums on the charts all at once was none other than Herb Alpert. And this came in 1966. It was the Whipped Cream and Other Delights album, sometimes called the most famous album artwork of all time. There was Going Places, possibly his best sounding album, but they're all so good. And then another album, What Now My Love, all of which were all of which went to number one within a 12-month period. And it was also in 1966 that Herb Alpert outsold the Beatles, outsold the Rolling Stones, outsold Frank Sinatra. He was the musician of that era. And that leads me to another interesting point. A lot of people tend to think of music based on what sociologists say about it rather than what musicians themselves say, or at minimum what devout music fans or musicologists say. And because of that, I think that we tend to have a simplistic view of what music was at any given time. So this sort of sociological, socio-anthropological point of view makes it seem as though there were the Beatles, the Stones, and other bands of that ilk, and then the other rock bands that came in the late 60s, and nothing else. Where the truth is far more musically diverse. Right up until the very end of the 60s, when Iron Butterflies In-A-Gadda-Da-Vida became the top selling album of 69, every other album virtually that came out and went to and became the top selling album of any given year, all of the others were soundtracks. So we were still very much in the age of the great American songbook, which expressed itself not only in pop records, but also on the Broadway soundtracks from which these songs came from. So you'd have someone like Rodgers and Hart, Rodgers and Hammerstein. They'd write a song for a Broadway musical. There'd be a film version of it. And somewhere in between the two, all of the major pop artists would cut singles of the sort of biggest songs taken from those musicals. And so that was still very much a thing of the 60s. Sinatra, people tend to associate him sociologically or anthropologically with the 1940s and 1950s. However, some of his best works came, I would say, not only in the 60s, and I know people find this controversial, but in the 70s as well. But let's just look at the 60s. He had albums like Sinatra in Strings, orchestrated by Don Costa. Masterpiece of an album. He had Strangers in the Night, Fly Me to the Moon, the version that we all know and love, My Way. Sinatra owned the 60s as much as anyone else. Some of his most memorable songs and memorable albums to that effect came out in the 60s. So back to Herb Alpert. Why was he so beloved? Well, the music was just fun. It was sophisticated enough to be cool. It was something that, even if most of the things you listen to are more sort of hardcore bebop or post-bop jazz, it was still legit enough that it could appeal to you. But it was pop enough for you to snap your fingers along with it. And the melody lines were so very strong that even though most of what he did was instrumental music, no vocals, you could sing along to the melody line because the melody lines of Herb Alpert's music were so well defined, so well pronounced, and so vividly played. For those of you, I should have probably said this in the first few minutes of the stream, but Herb Alpert was a trumpet player. Right. So remedial lessons over with back to the back to the interesting parts. So he was churning out high quality albums consistently in the 60s. And his success was a surprise even to himself. He thought that when he recorded the first Tijuana Brass album, which was called The Lonely Bull, that it was something he almost thought of a kind of novelty album of let's combine sort of American style pop arrangements with some jazz sensibilities and a sort of Americanized version of Mexican mariachi music, put it out there and let it go. But the popularity of that and the follow-up album proved so immense that he put together a full-time touring version of the Tijuana Brass, took them around the world. They were all over television and people absolutely loved them. There was just something that was absolutely irresistible about this combination of mariachi music, pop, instrumental pop music, and just a tiny bit of jazz sensibilities, ever so tiny, thrown in. And it just worked really well. Now, this was the 60s of the skinny ties and of the people buying increasingly beautiful and sophisticated cars. It was an era where the fashion and the music were very different than a lot of the sort of ex post facto sociological analysis of the 60s. Now, when looking at who was more defining of the 60s in the 60s, I would say that unless you were in your teens or early 20s, Herb Alpert was more important to you than the Beatles. And that might sound shocking, but if you were in your 30s, 40s, or 50s, there was much more of a chance that you'd be listening to a Herb Alpert LP when you were home, or listening to a radio station playing his music while you were in the car, than you would of the Beatles and similarly derived rock and roll. Rock and roll at the time was very much a young person's music. And as rock and roll's attitude got ever more revolutionary and anti establishment as the 60s rolled on, I mean, rock and roll always had that element, but it became very politically pronounced in the Vietnam era. The divide between, the short-haired middle-aged people and the young-haired young people became even wider. And so again, Woodstock makes for really good conversations to be held, for good books to be written, documentaries to be made. Don't get me wrong, it was an incredibly important musical event, but so was Herb Albert. It's just not the kind of storyline that sells those kinds of sensationalist books, or makes for, visually stunning documentaries. People want to see naked hippies climbing up a fence to get into a concert that's free now, man. Then they want to see a guy wearing a bow tie playing the trumpet, while some guys in sort of smart Mexican style clothes play the marimba and shake some maracas. That's just the reality. And again, that's why I think that documenting music and talking about music should be left more to musicians and music, and sort of music fanaticists, than social anthropologists. I mean, after all, if your house is on fire, you want the best fireman available. You don't want the best baker in the world, although maybe he could, hold the bread over the flames and do something. But maybe not the best analogy there. So, why then do we think of the 60s as a monolith of an age of rock and roll, rather than an age where Sinatra had some of his best singles, when Elvis truly became a highly mature recording artist, when people like Sinatra were at their finest, arguably some of Dean Martin's biggest hits, some of Perry Como's biggest hits, a lot of interesting instrumental music, whether it be the sort of easy listening stuff like Jackie Gleason, who was still selling lots of albums, the 101 Strings that were really hitting their prime, or stuff that was really on the cool side of the hip population, apart from the very young, people like Herb Alpert. Why do we only see this as a monolith and as a rock and roll decade? There's several reasons, and one obviously is what I've been alluding to throughout this, is that anthropologists, much like people in the journalism business, they see life in terms of, if it bleeds, it leads. And again, naked hippies sell tickets to documentaries and they sell books more than people wearing suits and ties. But it goes deeper than that too, because music has always had a very co equal relationship with technology. The necessities that musicians create make technology, and forces technologists to invent things to give musicians what they want. At the same time, technologists doing their experiments on their own and doing their research and development, making their new wonderful machines, that influences music too. And both of these things happened in the 60s. So what am I talking about? Well, I'm talking about amplified sound. The amplifiers got more powerful, the speakers got bigger, the PA systems got more efficient, the monitoring systems took on their modern form. Now, what kind of music did this favor? Well, it favored music that, one, was able to play loud and make sense. So you could obviously mic up a trumpet and put it through a huge Marshall amplifier with all sorts of effects. And if you're Miles Davis, that might work for a while. If you're Herb Alpert, less so. Herb Alpert was able to get everything he needed out of his trumpet without massive amplification systems and effects. But what instrument does lend itself to that? The electric guitar. Not if you're Wes Montgomery. You don't need it if you're Wes Montgomery, but you want it if you're John McLaughlin and Jimi Hendrix and Eric Clapton and Robin Trower and Jeff Beck. and Jimmy Page. And so we have a music style rising to prominence because it was tailor made for the new technologies of the day. And in fact, its existence motivated the technologists to make the amplifiers bigger, better, more powerful, more stable. And that allowed you to create keyboard instruments that were bigger and louder than before. Really put, you could run a Hammond organ through a Marshall, amp up a Leslie, put that through a Marshall, do whatever you want, have a bunch of Fender Rhodes going through a big amplifier, the Moog synthesizer, which could cut through all the other sounds because of its uniquely powerful and poignant frequencies. And this also allowed drummers to experiment with much larger drum kits, because now not only could the guitars play as loud or louder than a drum set because of the amplifiers, but because of the better monitoring situations that you had, you could achieve a balance on stage where the musicians could increasingly hear each other, irrespective of how loud any one of the musicians was playing. And likewise, the advances in PA systems by this time allowed audiences to hear a much better balance than before. And so I think that's a hugely forgotten element, that while the 60s, much like the 70s, was very diverse musically, by the end of the 60s, you do have rock and roll dominating the pop music landscape. That is to say, at the beginning of the 60s, most arrangements of pop music were either watered down versions of jazz, or in some cases, sort of easy listening, light classical. Now, what do I mean by that? Think a string section backing a Perry Como or Frank Sinatra. Think Count Basie playing with Frank Sinatra. Think of someone on a drum set like Hal Blaine swinging away behind Dean Martin. It was jazz derived, watered down jazz. This wasn't, Art Blakey. This wasn't Kenny Burrell, but it was still a jazz musical nomenclature, a jazz musical language. By the end of the 60s, that had largely been replaced in pop music by a rock and roll musical language. And that didn't mean that the 70s wasn't a very diverse time for music. I would argue that in the 70s, music was even more diverse in terms of all of the styles that all achieved so much unique success in terms of sales and prominence and even, artistic celebration. But what was unique about the 60s is that even though pop music exited the decade speaking a different musical language than at the beginning of the decade, for most of the decade, most of the population, like I said, would have been into sort of the very cool type of stuff like Herb Alpert than they would into the hot type of stuff like the Led Zeppelins or the Pink Floyds that came out at the end of the decade. It would take really until the mid 70s until the people who were teens in the 60s were now in their 30s and 40s in the 70s. And that only helped solidify the position of rock and roll further as the lingua franca of musical arrangements of the pop charts. And so, again, it would be, if you want to know, if short of having a flux capacitor, if you want to know what the musical landscape was in 1966, don't reach for one of those books about this is what the 60s was like, man, especially if it's got a guy going like this on the cover, because you're going to get a very one-sided view. You're going to get a view where they say, oh, the only music that mattered was music that was reacting to the war in Vietnam. Well, that music was very important, but it wasn't the only show in town. You want to get a view of everything that people of all ages and demographics were listening to. So look at the Billboard, look at Billboard's charts from every month of the 60s. Try to get your hands on some radio playlists from the era. If there are any recordings that people have uploaded of major radio stations of the time, and there are, go to YouTube and check those out. Try to look at some archived magazines or newspapers from the era to see what kind of music people were listening to. And if you meet someone who was, older than 5 in the 1966 and therefore has a memory of what he or she was hearing on the radio or in the record store, speak to them. Some of them who are maybe not afflicted with whatever Joe Biden's got, some of them maybe actually will remember and they'll tell you all about it. And that, like I said, it's better to learn about that's your real flux capacitor. I'll put it that way. The books and the documentaries that are focused on a sensationalist single demographic will seek to impose that demographic's preferences onto the entire history and even historiography of the music of that era. It was much more diverse than you might think. And like I said, it really took to the end of the decade for the rock and roll musical language, the idiomatic arrangements of rock and roll, to take over the pop charts. Now, what do I mean by that? I've talked about that before, but what I mean by that is, okay, when you have the jazz idiom dominating the pop charts, you'll have the drums being swung da 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 da, as opposed to a backbeat. Da, ba, 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 ba. So the rhythmic proclivities changed, the instrumentation changed. By the time you get to the late 60s and early 70s, you'll hear a more diverse keyboards, you'll hear a more electric guitar, you'll hear less saxophone and less brass in pop music. Not entirely. And then, of course, there's sort of bands in the rock world like Chicago who made brass very cool. But these are just the general trends. Strings seem to always fit in to pop music, maybe because the violin is, along with the piano, the sort of two main instruments, and for the last 1,000 years in various forms. I mean, the piano is only about 300 years old, but in various forms, those are the instruments that have driven European music and, in fact, beyond. But I think you get what I'm saying. So, what's the conclusion of all this when it all comes down to it? Well, I would say that if I had to pick a king of 60s music, it would be Herb Alpert, who's celebrating his 90th birthday this year. And he's alive and well. He's going out on tour and he's playing this music from the 60s that really started off his career, which then continued as the co-founder of A&M Records, who signed so many artists from the Carpenters to the Police to Supertramp to Rick Wakeman to Gino Vanelli. So he knew good music when he heard it too. As always, like, subscribe, and we'll see you next time. Take care.